Welcome to the Leme podcast, brought to you by NUGAS, the National Union of Greek Australian Students.
We aim to be the platform for representation of Greek and Greek Australian youth, discussing all things relevant to you guys, our incredible listeners.
Before we jump into this week's episode, we would like to say that NUGAS Victoria respectfully acknowledges the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and record our content. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, as well as to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the wider community and beyond. We acknowledge that the land on which we meet is stolen land and that Indigenous sovereignty has never been ceded and treaties are yet to be negotiated. We additionally acknowledge the Wurundjeri people's living culture, knowledge and struggle in this region. You, Vares, will plead that your statues and pictures have adorned the city and the forum of the people of Rome, a decoration splendid to the eye, but painful and melancholy to the heart and mind. I looked at the brilliant show that was made by your thefts, by the robbing of our provinces, by the spoliation of our friends and allies, a large number of persons from Asia and Greece who happened at the time to be serving on deputations, beheld in our forum the revered image of their gods that had been carried away from their own sanctuaries, and recognizing as well the other statues and works of art, some here, some there, would stand gazing at them with weeping eyes, objects wrenched from our allies by criminals and robbers. Quote from Cicero indicting Vares. Welcome to this episode of Leme, brought to you by NUGAS Victoria. I am your host, Eleni, and today we will be dissecting the function of art in both cultural and individual identities through examples of the Parthenon Marbles, Hagia Sophia, as well as our guest Olympia Nelson's role as muse, subject, and daughter of the late Pallaconian Papapetrou. We will also be talking with Miltiadis Paikopoulos, a classic student and fellow peer at the University of Melbourne.
So a massive thank you and a warm welcome to both our guests, Miltiadis and Olympia. I met both of our guests at our university, so the University of Melbourne. Both very, very intelligent people, know a lot about history, so I'm super excited to have them on this episode. We'll start with you, Olympia, first. So you're our first guest, and she is the daughter of the late Pallaconian Papapetrou. You were featured as both muse and worked as with the curators of the NGV exhibit in honour of your mum. So what are you currently studying and what have you previously studied?
So I finished my BA with honours last year. I'm just dedicating this year to preparing for postgrad studies. So at the moment I'm learning ancient Greek. I'm also learning German as well to help with my ancient Greek studies, which sounds a bit weird, but a lot of the literature that I want to look at is actually in German because they're great scholars of Greek history. So yeah, I majored in art history and literature. So ideally I'd like to do something in this discipline. And so yeah, for the kind of art and poetry that I want to look at, it's, I guess, important to have a good understanding of ancient Greek and Kine. So yeah, that's what I'm doing at the moment.
Yeah, beautiful. It sounds like you've got a lot of knowledge on the different aspects of this episode. So I'm super excited to tap into that. And we've also got Miltiadis, who is the president of the Pallaconian Brotherhood Youth and is incredibly passionate about history, especially ancient history. We've had a few classes together, so I can definitely vouch for that. So what are you currently studying and how are your studies going?
Well, thanks for having me on, Eleni. So I'm in the third year of my undergraduate degree. It's an arts degree. I'm majoring in classics and ancient world studies, and that means that I focused on the civilizations of the ancient world and the languages that they would have spoken, so Latin and ancient Greek. I've been really lucky to specialize in Sparta in particular, so that feeds well into my role in Pallaconians as well. But my equal passions at the moment have been mainly self-taught, which are economics, Byzantine civilization, and sort of Hellenism more broadly.
Beautiful. Well, a massive thank you again for coming on, and I'm super excited about speaking to you guys about the different topics very soon.
Thank you for having us.
So there was an NGV exhibition in honour of Pallaconian Papapetrou's work. This exhibition comprises of photographs by Australian photographer Pallaconian Papapetrou, born in 1960 and passed away in 2018. Her daughter Olympia was the muse, and it's covering the period from her birth in 1997 until the artist's death in 2018. Throughout this time, Olympia played a particularly important role in the artist's image making, assuming the complex roles of model and muse, collaborator and champion. And Olympia is our guest today, as you met her just before. Can you tell us a little bit about your mum and her work and where you fit into all that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was the subject of her works. So we worked together basically from when I was born to when she died, which was a little over 2 years ago now. So our relationship was unusual in that obviously we were both, but we were also photographer, subject, artist, muse. So although we had this relationship that was normal in the sense that it was mother-daughter, it also had this other dimension where we were making art together.
Yeah, it's a very complex sort of identity. And I wanted to ask, how important did you find your mother's work and the role that you had in that in the formation of your identity? Is the muse and the daughter inextricably linked together?
Yeah, absolutely. And it undoubtedly shaped who I am today. I'm very grateful for it because I was able to experience acting different characters. I got to experience what theatre is. I was also acting with my brother. So my brother's 2 years younger than me, and he would always, although he wasn't the kind of primary subject of my mum's works, he was always kind of there in the studio in the background, and he was always making me laugh even when I had to be serious. So I mean, for a child, it was quite a big undertaking, but for me, it was also very normal because it was all that I knew. So like I was normal in that I would go to school 5 days a week. I always have Greek school on Saturdays. I'd have my music lessons, but then I'd also get to undertake this project with my family, and it was a family collaboration. So I'm, very grateful for it, and it was an incredibly special experience.
Yeah, it seems like your mum's work helped to formulate your whole family's identity, not just your own. So it seems like they've got different roles within the whole process, both in the background and behind and in front of the camera, which is a really interesting sort of dynamic that you guys have established. And I'm assuming that it's a dynamic that somehow has continued on even after she's passed away.
Absolutely. And we are still continuing her legacy, and that's sort of how my role has changed. So I've gone from being model and subject and muse, and that will always be my role. But now our relationship as mother and daughter is evolving in that I'm continuing her legacy. So although she's passed away, our relationship is still able to evolve, and that's definitely felt throughout my whole family. So my dad painted a lot of the backdrops. He also was a really good lighting technician, so he helped with he was always able to look up at the sky when we were shooting outside, and he'd know exactly how many seconds we'd have with good light. He'd just look up at the clouds and he'd be like, okay, well, we've got 20 seconds to take this one picture. He was really amazing at that. And then my yaya was a modistra, so she came to Australia with her 3 sisters and her brother. All of the women were seamstresses. I forget the word in English. Dressmakers.
Dressmakers.
And so she made all the costumes for Mum's works. And then my brother and I acted as her subjects. So, huge family collaboration.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And what I find very inspiring, having lost a parent myself, is that you are honoring your mother and the artist in the same way, in a very, very beautiful yet almost confronting way. I don't know how I would possibly cope with constantly having reminders of my father who's passed away all the time. It would be quite mentally difficult, bit of a challenge, even though you're honoring, you feel grateful that you have that opportunity. On the other hand, it's a consistent reminder that they're no longer with you, and that's more the parent as opposed to the artist. So it's a very complex thing.
Absolutely. And I think what the hardest thing, especially at the start, was that when I'd have interviews with the media, I'd always have to be expected to keep a certain face and to talk about her on TV and on the radio with a completely straight face and smiling as well. And then underneath that, there's obviously a lot of pain, and sometimes you just want to sit there and cry. But I mean, it's always so special for me to get to share our journey, because it is so intimate and it is so special. But again, in those first few months where the grief was particularly raw, it was definitely a lot harder for me. But yeah, I mean, I'm just so grateful for the opportunity to be able to talk about it.
Yeah, amazing. You're a very inspirational person. I've said that time and time again. But I do want to touch on the controversy surrounding your mum's work. And in regards to that, the role you played in the work as a muse was the main controversy, to my understanding. So especially in your younger years, how did that affect your identity, being both the muse, daughter, borderline also defender of your mum and your family's work together? How did that sort of shape your identity?
Yeah, it's a great question because it absolutely shaped my identity. Like, I'll just give a bit of background. So we were contacted by a magazine called Art Monthly, and they wanted to use an image that my mum had taken of me 5 years prior to use on the front cover of their magazine. In the picture, I am nude, but I was 6 years old, and 5 or 6 years old. And the image was published on the magazine shortly after a controversy regarding nudity or children being in the nude in art, and whether this is pornography or not. And at the time, we were under quite a conservative government. So our picture was heavily criticised. And there were allegations that, that my parents had forced me to take the picture, and just all these kinds of ridiculous things, even that the image was inherently sexual because I'm in the nude. So these all came to light when I was 11. So I was in grade 6 at the time. I literally woke up and got ready for school like any other day, and we had the TV going in there. I saw my picture on the news with 2 big black boxes censoring my nipples. We're talking about a 6-year-old child, yeah. So that was really insane for me. But I just got up and went to school and started my day like any other day. We did start to get kind of swarmed by paparazzi, and we was sort of trapped in our house for about a fortnight. I remember my brother and I tried to watch an episode of The Simpsons in the front room, and we had there was a woman like banging at the door.
You're joking.
She was looking at us through the blinds and trying to get us to answer questions. Like, we're talking about a girl who's 11 years old and her 9-year-old brother. Just complete harassment. We were able to leave the house through the back door. We just left to go to my yaya and papa's house in Springvale, so they couldn't find us. But yeah, it was definitely a crazy time, but I had this urge to defend the image, and I ended up walking out of the house and talking to the media, confronting them about it, defending the image. And I did this. No one told me to do this. And then, of course, my parents were criticized for apparently brainwashing me and spoon-feeding me language, and basically anything I did was met with criticism. But I'm so glad I did it. Like, I look back on it now, and for me, it just felt like I was doing what was right. I didn't have to think twice about it.
You were staying true to yourself and your family's work.
Exactly.
But it would be very difficult. I know that even now, if someone makes a criticism of my father, I'm like, excuse me. I'm like, he's passed away. He's not here to defend himself. And as a child, I want to defend him, but it's very difficult to be both the child, the person who's grieving, and then have that sort of look of, oh, you're just sort of a kid. You're the kid of that person you don't really know. So you are incredibly brave, and I thank you so much for being so honest and for sharing that, because I think it will resonate with a lot of people who have lost parents as well, but also people who are really close with artists who go under controversy and who are questioned and criticized for sticking by their art form and their work. So thank you so much for sharing that, Olympia.
Thank you so much. I really, I can't tell you how much I appreciate your sensitivity, and I know you know what it's like to deal with grief, and at our age, it's not something that a lot of people have necessarily gone through. But yeah, I thank you so much for talking to me about it and listening.
No, of course. I'm sure that there's plenty of people who are going to listen to this episode and think the same thing about your family and you. So it is beautiful. So we'll move on to the next segment very soon, talking about art and cultural identity.
Jeffrey Robertson's book, Who Owns History, has an outstanding quote. It starts saying, "They introduce the idea that great art is not just property, but has a special quality, that of heritage because of its continuing significance to the people from whom it has been wrested, and a cultural value because of its religious or political context or connotation, all through the historical memories it evokes." This is in the preface of his book on page 10. This quote introduces us to the idea that art has a cultural identity as well. It has a tie towards the people whom created it, whom it was created for, and that's why controversies surrounding different aspects of our history, especially the Greek history, indicate that it's something that transgresses generations. It is something that is a part of our identity regardless of whether we were there when it was created or when it was completed or when the idea came about, which is why the Parthenon Marbles and Hagia Sophia are really important discussions we need to have, and the education around it, the history around it, the controversies around it is something that we really need to dissect.
So, Miltiadis, can you give us a bit of background around the Parthenon Marbles, also known as the Elgin Marbles, and the controversy surrounding them?
Sure. Well, it's a relatively long and convoluted history, but the Parthenon as we know it was constructed around 440, 430 BC. And that's at a time when Athens and its empire were at their peak. Both the construction and the design were influenced by the project's master builder or architect, Phidias. It served as a temple to Athena Parthenos, so that's Athena the Virgin. And the marbles, as we commonly refer to them, are a series of marble sculptures that adorn the temple, and which for the most part can be split into three distinct groups. So that's the metopes, the frieze, and the pediments. Obviously the metopes, we'll use the Anglo-Saxon pronunciation. The metopes were the square marble plates that sat above the temple's columns, sculpted to depict scenes mainly from Greek mythology. So although there were originally 92 of these, last time I checked, there were 55 known metopes today, or metopes. So I should stick to the Anglo-Saxon of Greek. Some metopes were damaged or destroyed in the Christianization of Greece, and many more were destroyed in 1687. That's during the Moravian War, when the Parthenon was used by the Ottomans as a munition store, so for gunpowder and arms, and that exploded under Venetian cannon fire. And the year after, the Ottomans used the broken and scattered remains of the metopes in the construction of the Acropolis walls, which now in a different form stand around there. During the Ottoman occupation up until the 1800s, we also know that not only did the Turkish population burn fragments of the metopes and the sculptures for their lime, but Westerners, especially aristocrats, were allowed with explicit or implicit Turkish approval to take pieces of the metopes away as almost souvenirs. The second major component of the marbles is the Parthenon frieze. This adorned the top of the inner temple, and that was known as the naos. And this frieze was originally formed up of around 160 meters of marble, of which around only 80% survives. So the majority of the frieze that survives is held at the British Museum in London, and the second largest component is displayed in the Acropolis Museum in Athens. And the rest of the frieze, which survives, is split between the Louvre in Paris, the Vatican Museums, the National Museum in Copenhagen, the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna, the University Museum in Würzburg, and the Glyptothek in Munich, so a lot of German and European museums. The pediments compose the third part of the marbles, and these are the statues which originally rested on the east and west sides of the Parthenon facade. These statues generally are acknowledged to have been some of the largest pediment statues ever to have been carved in the classical period in Greece. And on the west side, the sculptures depicted the conflict between Athena and Poseidon over patronage of Athens, the famous story with the olive tree and the the freshwater spring, and on the east side was sculpted the birth of Athena. But during the Moravian War, again, when the Venetians and the Ottomans were at war over the Peloponnese, which is also called Morea, the Venetian general Francesco Morosini, who later became Doge of Venice, other than the explosion which he caused with his cannon fire, attempted the year after, when he captured Athens, to loot a large portion of the western pediment. But when he was winching the pediment down from the Parthenon, it broke and the piece fell and shattered. So he destroyed another large part of it in that process as well, trying to steal some of the Parthenon. And of the approximately 50 statues that formed the pediment originally, many of those that survive are still in the British Museum, the Louvre, or the smaller portion are in the Acropolis Museum. So a well-known example of that sort of Western travel acquisition is probably the most opportunistic as well, is that of Earl Thomas Bruce. So when we say Lord Elgin, we mean Thomas Bruce, that was his name, who from 1801 to around 1812 supervised the removal of around 75 metres of that Parthenon frieze, 21 sculptures from the pediments, and 15 of the 92 original metopes. Just keeping in mind that that's 15 of the surviving metopes, combined with a lone caryatid, which we all know are the female statues which acted as columns around the Erechthon. Part of the frieze from the temple of Athena Nike, and other fragments from across Greece. And they form what we collectively call, in the Anglosphere, or at least called, the Elgin Marbles, which are now more appropriately called the Parthenon Marbles. So the controversy, which we were talking about before, is to do this, Elgin claimed to have received official assent or approval from the Ottoman Sultan, called a firman. However, the copy he later presented to Parliament as proof of that assent was actually an English translation of what he claimed to have been an Italian copy made at the time, right? So there's a lot of distance from the original already. And this translation is kept at the British Museum, the one presented to Parliament. However, the original Ottoman firman can't be found. It's either it's been searched for in personal records, Greek records, Turkish archives, and what's more troubling is that the firman, the Ottoman Sultan's official assent notes, are generally really well looked after and stored. So the fact that we can't find this one is troubling, to say the least. And what's more dubious is that when Parliament was presented with the English translation, all on the testimony, not of Elgin, but Elgin's associate, Philip Hunt, Elgin, 2 weeks earlier, when he testified before Parliament, had known nothing about this translation. So that's also very, very suspicious.
Makes you want to laugh, yeah.
I know. Well, there's a lot of problems so far in the story. And the translation offered to Parliament also has questions over its veracity, because the translation claims that it was signed with a signet stamp by a Turkish official. But the Italian copy, which we've later found, which was in the possession of William St. Clair, makes no note of this signet or signature.
Right, okay.
So we already now have a gap between the English translation and the Italian original, we'll call it. Now, it's doubtful because the claim to British legality rests on a firman that was Italian and English at the same time, and an original which doesn't exist. So when we look to the experts who've scrutinised the Italian firman, and a good example of that is Paul Cartledge, the emeritus professor, it was addressed not to Lord Elgin, as he claimed as proof of his assent to actually remove the marbles, but it was actually addressed to the governor, the Ottoman governor and judge of Athens. And it outlined very specific and limited powers under which he could remove certain things. And obviously he surpassed those and circumvented them in other cases. It's good to remember as well, Eleni, that at the time, Elgin had a very large estate and lacking in, let's say, some of the aristocratic embellishments that his peers would have had. So when he removed these, it was definitely with the intent to furnish his estate, his large estate. And the only reason that they ended up in the British Parliament's jurisdiction is because he had a very costly divorce. And in the settlement, he needed to sell off his personal estates, and he decided to sell them to the British Parliament and to the British state, through which they arrived in the possession of the British Museum. Now, there are some eyewitnesses that saw the removal of the marbles, and one of them is Edward Clark. And in their eyewitness account, they state that the Ottoman commander, the Acropolis fort commander, actually tried to stop Elgin and his men from removing the marbles. But in the process, he was bribed by Elgin to continue it. So if there was a firman, such a bribe, it can be assumed, would not have been necessary at all. So there is the implication there that he didn't have the
authority,
the authority, the extent that he claimed to have. So in essence, the controversy that we're debating here, or at least I guess there's not much debate, we're all in agreement.
100%.
The controversy surrounding the marbles is that of legality, morality, and diplomacy. So in terms of diplomacy, after its independence by the 1830s, and most notably under the leadership of Milena Mercouri from the 1980s onwards, the modern Greek state has had a pretty good deal of advocating for the repatriation of the marbles. So in terms of international law, the repatriation is commonly justified in accordance with Article 26 of the 1982 UNESCO resolution, and that was from the UNESCO World Conference on Cultural Policies. And further, because of the sort of dubious legality and the twofold imperialism that the marbles suffered, so consider that Greece was an occupied, colonized country, not only by the Ottomans, but there was that grasping sort of opportunistic imperialism that we suffered at the hands of all those Western aristocrats who sort of looted Greece in the name of either personal gain or claims of and conservation. So in terms of popular support in more recent years, some people might not know this, but I'll list some names of famous individuals who've actually supported the repatriation of the marbles. And they include Tom Hanks, Bill Murray, Robin Williams, Judi Dench, Stephen Fry, Liam Neeson, George and Amal Clooney, and that's just a few. They're all readily available online. And if people want to find out more about those, there are many committees internationally and nationally for the repatriation of the marbles, and you can just search them up. So to sort of conclude, until recently, the British Museum claimed that Elgin's seizure of the marbles actually saved them from further damage. But British cleaning efforts and the industrial pollution, the famous fog in the 1930s and all the way to the 50s in London, actually did more harm than their Greek counterparts that had remained either in the Parthenon or in museums around Greece. Then afterwards, the British Museum claimed that the Greeks actually wouldn't have somewhere to properly house the marbles. And yet Greece built a purpose-designed Acropolis Museum to house them. And not only was that patronizing sort of from the onset, but it's obsolete now after the construction of the museum. And then finally, I guess the museum had to default to an argument of sort of that encyclopedic museum, sort of the museum is universal, the British Museum, and that the marbles are world heritage and belong in a place where everyone gets to attach meaning to them. But I would say that they should look to the evidence, which is that recent polls conducted around Britain, and specifically in London as well, show that the majority of those polled actually support the repatriation of the marbles to Greece. And it's also interesting to assume that who is everyone? If everyone gets to enjoy them, how is the Acropolis Museum not universal? And if the importance is to attach meaning to the artifact, how much more meaning can you attach than having it overlooking the actual monument to which they formed a part? So I would say that the more meaningful connection could be made if it's displayed in the Acropolis Museum with its brothers.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Miltiadis. That's incredibly in-depth, and there's so much to unpack there. So when planning this episode, I was thinking about the different solutions that have been mentioned in the past and the different options that we sort of had. And when I was reading Jeffrey Robertson's book, Who Owns History, a quote stood out from page 32, and it says, "A few museums are beginning to salve their collective consciences by offering heritage items back on loan. But this is symbolic of a lingering colonialist mindset, a determination to possess and to impose conditions." So, Olympia, why is a loan not a viable option? Obviously, that quote is giving us some insight there, but what ideas have you heard that you think are suitable solutions for this issue?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fantastic quote, and we can definitely apply it to what's happening at the moment, not just with the Elgin Marbles, but also with, it's also quite relatable to Hagia Sophia and that controversy. I remember about 6 years ago, I think I would have been in year 12 at the time. So the British Museum decided to loan one of the disputed Parthenon marbles to Russia. They had, I think, must have been a Hermitage in St. Petersburg. And the response from Greece was just absolutely furious because it's not just, again, it's not an example of, as you read out, lingering colonialist mindset, but it's their history and culture which is then not just stolen, but then loaned and tossed around. I think, in a sense, it was done in good faith because the director of the museum would sort of hope that the Greek government would be able to view it as a positive thing that the marbles are on display to a new audience. But yeah, as Miltiadis was saying before, we have to remember that the Acropolis Museum was purpose-built with an objective to exhibit the sculptures. I think all of this sort of supports the argument that the marbles should be reunited, not just for ethical, aesthetic, scholarly, academic reasons, but really just for altruism. And the whole purpose-built museum, it sort of provided the first little glimmer of hope that one day they'd return to the place that they were created.
Yeah, and the Acropolis Museum, I've been twice in the past 4 years, and it is such an incredible museum. And the way that, for any of the listeners who haven't been there, the upper levels are glass walls, so you can actually view the Parthenon from there. And that's, you know, the location of the actual artifacts are in the building you're standing in, but when you look to the side, you're seeing, you know, a view essentially as if you were on top of the Parthenon yourself. You know, you're seeing the rest of Athens, you're seeing all these artifacts and buildings, and it's just a very united sort of space. It's a beautiful way that they have organized it to display these things, and it is quite a glaring missing piece for those who know the situation, that the artifacts that belong here, that were, you know, this space was created for, aren't there, and it's still being fought for. Even the Acropolis station, the metro station underneath, there's the mural of Melina Mercouri, who's doing so much work to get it back. So everywhere you go in Athens around that area has this sort of look of, okay, we are bleeding from the fact that we are still struggling to get this back when there's so much evidence in our favor. So it is quite eye-opening, that whole experience. Miltiadis, any thoughts on solutions? And obviously you gave us a very in-depth, so we know what you would like as well. But any other comments on that?
Yeah, well, the quote's really interesting. And in terms of a solution to the problem, I guess a lot of people would turn to things like international law. I mentioned UNESCO, and a few people would turn to just multilateral sort of international diplomacy. But at the end of the day, I'd say the track record for these two institutions have been that they can often be subordinate to private interests, national interests, and corporate interests. And the problem that raises, in my mind, is that our our argument ultimately stems from, or at least the care for our argument, our debate for repatriation, might use these as a means to an end to achieve repatriation, but ultimately it comes from that sort of deep national consciousness that we have as Greeks. And these artifacts are almost the inorganic component to that. So Greeks form the organic component, the life of Greece. And I guess that these artifacts are a good reminder of that contract that we sign, at least that we should sign, and that some people have forgotten these days, which is that when you're born, you don't just sign a contract in the short term to yourself and to those that come after you, but you should also sign a contract with those that came before you. Yeah. Because you have to understand that you wouldn't be there without them. So I guess that we have to appeal almost to an honourable solution, something that looks to justice as a good in itself, not something that has to be sort of bargained for and won. And I guess that in terms of the British approach, thousands of British philhellenes, and across the world too, not to forget the Louvre and German, European, continental museums, thousands of European philhellenes came and fought and bled and died for an independent Greek state. And now that it exists, and it has the facilities and it has the consciousness to survive for thousands of years of being Greek, it just seems that they are spitting in the face not only of the modern Greek state and modern Greeks, but also in the face of their own brave sort of philhellenes who fought and died for that vision just as much as any Greek did.
Yeah, it really brings forth the whole point of this episode about art is more than just the aesthetic or, the slight history connected with it. It is very much embedded in identity, whether that be individual like yours, Olympia, with your mum, or even us as Greeks, being part of the Ancient World Studies component to Melbourne Uni, you feel this element of I'm responsible to keep gaining more knowledge and to fight for what is to right the wrongs, essentially, and to spread awareness like we're doing through this episode. So the Parthenon Marbles function in so many complex different ways, and the solution needs to be dynamic in the sense that it needs to hit all those marks. It needs to make reparations for cultural identity, for both the actual physical bringing over of the marbles and putting them into the museum, but because if it's such a dynamic identity, it's going to have to be a solution that is hitting the mark and honouring the amount of people who have fought for this identity to exist freely. So it is a very, very interesting situation, and I think it's somewhat similar with the situation going on with Hagia Sophia as well. So Olympia, are you able to give us some insight into Hagia Sophia? What is Hagia Sophia, and what is the controversy surrounding it in the recent months?
Yeah, absolutely. So Hagia Sophia means holy wisdom. It was constructed in 537 under the Emperor Justinian. So he employed two men to build it, Anthemius and Isidore. They weren't actually architects. I think they were engineers and mathematicians. But he was so proud of what he built that he, upon seeing it for the first time, he exclaimed, "Oh, Solomon, I have outdone thee." And this is, it would become a kind of refrain. He says, "Nekinika se Solomon," or Solomon, that could be the vocative, I'm not too sure. But he was so proud of it. So a couple hundred years later, in about 726, this is during the period of iconoclasm. It was stripped of all religious illustrations, all kind of sculptural, figural works by iconoclasts. And so this was because there was a ruling that the veneration of icons was to be abolished. We see the Hagia Sophia meet a whole lot of different religions. So we see it become, obviously, first Byzantine Christian, in 1054 Greek Orthodox, but then 200 years later, it becomes Roman Catholic. And this is probably one of its most brutal periods where everything inside is met with a lot of anger. It becomes ravaged, defiled. It was really quite sad. So then we actually go back to Eastern Orthodox in 1261. And then some 200 years later, it becomes a mosque. So this is the first time it's becoming a mosque. That's following the fall of Constantinople. And it remains a mosque until the fall of the Ottoman Empire, and this is in the early 20th century. So it remains a mosque for a long time. Then in between 1933 to 1934, the Turkish government secularized the building. They did quite a lot of work on it, uncovering plasters. They then decided to convert it into a museum, and the original mosaics were restored. I really want to stress that they took a lot of care in doing this, and they really, really wanted to protect everything that was inside. So following this in Paris, UNESCO stated that Hagia Sophia was to become, or it encompassed part of the historic areas of Istanbul, and they explicitly state that it ought to be a museum with the purpose of serving a bridge between faiths and cultures. And this is, I think, a really, really important sentiment that we have to remember today following its reconversion. So just recently, earlier in July, it stood as a great museum. It accrued a number of tourists and people from all over the world of various faiths and cultures. A world that's, I would argue, more kind of varied than the Byzantine Empire could have ever conceived. So people who were once driven to the Hagia Sophia from a sense of piety, this sense had kind of changed because people were coming until now, people were coming as secular pilgrims rather than worshippers. So basically what our kind of dilemma is now is that we've got this famous church, now mosque, but built by Christians. It's full of Byzantine icons, so all Christian images, but all of a sudden it's being redefined as a fully functioning mosque. So now our kind of question is, and I'm raising this a little bit more in the next video that I'm making, but what do we actually do with all of the pictures inside? And this is something that I've been, as soon as it was announced, I was kind of wondering, well, so when everyone comes to pray, whom will they pray to? Obviously, there's the Qibla, which faces in the direction of Mecca, but the church is filled with Christian icons. So I was wondering, what are they going to announce? Will they say that they're covering them? And shortly after, I think it was Greek City Times published an article, which I actually can't find anymore, so they might have removed it.
Right.
But the article was something along the lines of Turkish government has decided to use or to employ a new kind of laser technology to cover all of the icons inside. And I thought, oh, okay, interesting. It would make sense, I guess, that they're trying out new kind of technological ideas to conceal icons. But otherwise, other news outlets just published that they would use curtains, which is kind of a traditional way of covering images. So my question now is, how do we feel about the covering of images in the Hagia Sophia? And can we see this as actually iconoclasm in 2020? Or can we view it in a more positive way and see it as acknowledging the holiness of Christian imagery and even protecting it? So I kind of, I'd like to bring attention to this choice and sort of suggest that we can be reconciled to it in a more positive way. But it is, of course, it is a decision that everything happens so quickly, I feel. Like there was talk last year about it happening in, I think, late 2019, but it's like we all woke up one day and just open Facebook or whatever, and you see Hagia Sophia has been reconverted into a mosque. It was very, very sudden. And in a sense, kind of, well, to me at least, it feels like it was a decision that was almost founded on a sense of mania and the fact that it happened so quickly. And that there was no real conversation with UNESCO. UNESCO themselves denounced it.
Yeah.
So, very, very quick and intense. But another thing that we have to keep in mind is that this isn't the first time that something like this has occurred. I mean, to me, it's the first. We've seen the Hagia Sophia encounter so many different histories and religions, but there are a lot of buildings worldwide that have been repurposed as either secular or even have been reconverted into mosques or churches.
Yeah, it's very it is one of those things that is also very, very complex. There's different aspects to it. There's different histories, and there's, you know, it's in a area of the world now that is predominantly Muslim, whether it was previously a Greek part of the world. So it's shifting communities, it's shifting histories, and, you know, as it keeps shifting and changing, it seems like there is a portion where people aren't looking at all the experiences that this building has been a part of. And so I wanted to ask a question. So what role does buildings and religious spaces play into a culture whose religion is so inextricably linked, with the majority of Greeks, both in the homeland and the diaspora, identifying as Greek Orthodox? So I'd imagine that there's not a lot of Greek Orthodox people, you know, living in that area like it used to be. And they're probably not thinking, I'm going to go to church in Hagia Sophia today because it's Sunday. That's probably not what's happening. It's more of a historical sort of space. But in terms of the fact that us in the diaspora, people in the homeland, are viewing this place, you know, as being such a symbol, what role does that sort of play? Does space art play in religion and culture that are tied together?
I think it's a fantastic question, and I'd argue that buildings and religious spaces play a huge role, and that's why it's important to either keep them as secular or keep them as having their original as having their original purpose. What we're seeing here is a flitting between purposes. So I think the move in 1993 to make Hagia Sophia secular was so positive, because it means that it can welcome anyone from any faith. But as I briefly touched on before, it's not the first instance that we've seen. So there are a number of examples actually in Greece, particularly in Crete. I think the island of Crete is a really good example of this, because even Hagia fuses architecture from Byzantine, Venetian especially, and Ottoman buildings. So they've got on the Venetian harbour, I've never been there, but I've just seen pictures of it. They've got the Mosque of the Janissaries, and it was erected when the Ottomans captured Hagia. But like the Hagia Sophia, it was built on the grounds of a former church. Then 10 or so years before Hagia Sophia was repurposed as a museum, the Mosque of the Janissaries in Hagia was actually, it stopped functioning as a religious building. And so since then it's been used as a cafe, even like an art gallery space, a restaurant, a tourist office. So it's given all of these secular and I guess really meaningful and useful purposes, where the original religious function isn't, it's not lost in any way or cancelled, but its original meaning is, I guess, frozen and it's kept there forever.
Yeah. Miltiadis, thoughts on all this controversy? Obviously, the Pallaconian Brotherhood have created the petition for Scott Morrison's denouncement of this move. So first of all, how is that going? And also, what is your sort of thoughts around what's going on?
Well, thanks for bringing up the petition, Eleni. It's going pretty well. I think it just ticked over 3,000 signatures. So we're thinking of submitting it actually to the APH, to the Australian Parliament. They have a petition submission form online. So we're thinking of having that submitted in a few days. We've had in their private capacity a few politicians, stakeholders show their support. We've been really blessed. We've had almost every single Greek media outlet in the I think share it in some way. So we've been pretty happy with that as well. And obviously, Olympia and yourself have been of great help in helping steer the sharing of that petition as well through your respective organisations. But I guess it feeds well into the debate of how the religious locus can sort of help feed into culture. And I'd say that what's a good way of explaining this? Well, for me, culture and religion are intertwined in the sense that national identity and identity more broadly has a lot to do with continuity and a lot to do with chronology. So I would say that unless some radically new pieces of information come to light, that whatever we would like to consider Greek culture, Hellenism more broadly, is the oldest living culture, right? Greece. And to a certain degree, Asia Minor, Cyprus, some parts of southern Italy, some parts of Egypt and the Black Sea and the Black Sea, so the Crimea. And what this means is that those sort of cultural, linguistic, religious parts of the ecumeny, they are interlinked in the sense that religion changes. We've Christianized, we've abandoned Hellenic polytheism, and we've obviously had occupation by numerous powers like the Ottomans, the Franks, even the Aragonese. You know, we've had many different. The British now, modern colonialism. But ultimately, what has kept us Greek is that core tenet of beliefs, language, belief in Hellenism. They are sort of, like you said, inextricable, but the changes that have come and gone haven't shaken our identity. So there's something sort of unstoppable, I guess, about Hellenism. And there's a very famous quote, which is when the patriarch was sort of attacked outside Constantinople by a mob after the occupation and during the independence of Greece, the war for the independence of Greece. And, you know, he said, you can't wipe out Hellenism, you know, because as long as there's a Greek somewhere in the world, Hellenism's alive. So I would say that is exactly how I sort of view Hellenism, you know, and to turn around a corner and see and hear someone speak Greek or even for those that believe in, you know, the polytheists, I still, you know, I still get emotional about that. And when I hear a Byzantine chant or when I you know, when I see the plaster casts that they've got, which look horrible, but are meant to look horrible in the sense that you're drawn to the fact that the marbles are not in our possession. Those remind you that you know, to be Greek is a story. It's like a mosaic, a living mosaic, and we all form part of that. But so do our institutions, so does our religion, so does our belief system, our culture, our understanding, our way of life. So you know, you, Eleni, you, Olympia, are just as important to what it is to be Greek as, let's say, the Parthenon Marbles. But that's to say that the Hagia Sophia is as well, and to convert it or to change its path, its trajectory without the Greek people being informed about that, that to me is the problem, because it's tyranny sort of in the highest sense.
Yeah, I think that the really important thing in both these examples is that the ones whose building or artifacts or artwork it is were not consulted or given the right authority or agency to be a part of the conversation as to what happens to them. You know, it's like, especially with the marbles, it's like someone stealing your stuff, claiming this whole thing after you've been in a vulnerable position, and then you're kids, grandkids fighting to get it back, and they're like, oh, we might give it back to you for a little bit on loan, even though it's inherently yours. And that's what's sort of a bit, messed up about both situations, is that, Hagia Sophia originally, it was built as a Greek Orthodox building. It's gone through all these different stages, and that's history that happens. But decisions are being made without Greeks necessarily, Greek government, Greek, the country or the people being really involved. And to take that even further, most of the world looking at these situations recognize it too. It's not a sense of we're biased because, we're Greek and we want, it's very touching to us. A lot of people across the world are viewing both situations and going, this doesn't seem right, and I'm not Greek. They're agreeing with this situation, because when it comes to voices being oppressed and actions being subdued, just because one is slightly more powerful or in a more advantaged position, people get upset, understandably. And just because it's an artifact and not, a real, like a person, it doesn't mean that it's still wrong. It's still wrong. It means it has a value and a meaning that will transcend generations. I could imagine my kids in the future that this is something that I will be talking to them about, and hopefully by that point, wrongs would be righted. But it's a very interesting sort of pathway. So
Well, then it's Greeks and everybody, I guess, around the world should understand that history is ultimately a series of conflicts and competition. So history is very competitive. So if anything, and there's a takeaway from this, it's that Greeks, anybody listening really, should, I guess, radicalize themselves in the sense that they can do something about it. They can take part in that competition. It just so happens that some voices, like you said, are louder. So it's one step to be proud as a Greek, and it's another step to take that pride and put it into action. So I would say that, watching Olympia's video would be a good start to educate yourself about the Hagia Sophia, and then you take it a step further, and you can reach out to her, reach out to yourself, take part in Greek organisations, and compete in that sense, that it is almost a fight. It's almost a struggle. Yeah. So we're all in it, I guess, in that struggle.
Yeah, 1000%. And in the description of this episode, I'll put all the links that we used in formulating this episode, both the petition from Pallaconian Brotherhood, Olympia's Hagia Sophia video, the NGV online exhibit, because obviously in person we can't go visit anything. So I'll put that link there as well. And also the Jeffrey Robertson book, Who Owns History, I'll put a link there so that, anyone listening that's wanting to join in on pursuing knowledge on these situations and sort of expanding your views on these different issues, on these, I would say, global issues, you have that access. And as Miltiadis said, by all means, contact any of us on this episode today, contact NUGAS Vic, contact Pallaconians, PanMac. There's so many different organizations that are doing a lot. So I want to say a massive thank you to both you, Olympia, and Miltiadis, for joining me on this episode.
It was my pleasure.
No, thank you so much, Eleni. It was such a great conversation, such a pleasure to talk to you both and to hear from you both.
Yeah, amazing. And I'm sure so many listeners as well will really, I think gain a lot from this episode too. So thank you for taking the time, energy, for writing up all those answers as well and giving us such an in-depth descriptions. And yeah, contact us if you guys are curious about anything that we discussed, or give us a follow and comment any of your thoughts as well. And one final thank you to you both. And you guys will be hearing from Miltiadis and Olympia in future episodes as well. I know we're going to be recording with Olympia very, very soon. So yeah, definitely get used to their voices. They'll be back. All right. Have a good day, guys. Bye.
Thanks, Eleni.
Thanks, Eleni.
I just want to thank you all for listening to this episode, and I hope that you really take on board everything we discussed and really explore it for yourselves as well. I want you all to think about this quote that is also from Jeffrey Robertson's book. It is by Benedict Savoy when they resigned from the Humboldt Forum Advisory Board in July 2017. It says, "I want to know how much blood is dripping from each artwork."
That's it for another episode of the Leme from NUGAS Victoria.
We hope you guys enjoyed our chat today. We are very thankful to all our listeners, both old and new.
If you want to stay updated on anything NUGAS and Taleme related, our social media contacts are in the podcast description, and please subscribe to us on any platform that you are listening to us on.
We welcome you to leave comments and shoot us a message on our social media if you love this episode. If you have any thoughts on future episode ideas, or if you have any special guests that you think deserve a platform to share their voice, experiences and thoughts. As usual, we hope you all have a beautiful day.
Taleme.